Hey, Dad. I'm gonna start another one. Baseball is back, at least in an exhibition way, but I'm still gonna do some baseball things. Tosca is sitting next to me and whacking the camera with her tail. This is number 14, Lou Gehrig. Many people believe Lou Gehrig's story and his life ended on that Independence Day in 1939 when he gave the most famous speech in the history of baseball, the history of sports, and one of the most famous speeches in the history of America. At first, it seemed he would not speak at all that day. The Yankees had declared it Lou Gehrig Day, and more than 61,000 people came to the ballpark. Gehrig was so utterly overcome with emotion that Babe Ruth, his friend and rival, came over to him and whispered in his ear, come on, kid, buck up now, we're all with you." "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced to the crowd, "Lou has asked me to thank you all for him. He is too moved to speak." Here's Tosca, Dad. Hi. Say hello, Tosca. She's a good girl, but she's very, very friendly and angry because I'm holding her. Okay. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced to the crowd, "Lou has asked me to thank you all for him. He is too moved to speak." The crowd roared louder and louder, shrieks of support and love until Gehrig took steps forward. "I knew he would speak," his wife Eleanor told a reporter as she watched him from the stands. And sure enough, Gehrig braced himself and stepped to the microphone. "For the past 2 weeks," Gehrig said after a moment of reflection, "you've been reading about a bad break." He meant break, but was so overcome by emotion that he could not finish the word. He stopped again to compose himself. "Today," he continued, "I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." The crowd cheered loudly as he looked down. "I've been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans. When you look around, wouldn't you consider it a privilege to associate yourself with such fine-looking men as are standing here in uniform in this ballpark today?" Again, the fans nodded and shouted. Gehrig thanked everybody who came to mind, his teammates, his manager, the Yankees owner, the groundskeepers, the office staff, the sports writers, the people running the concession stands. He even thanked the New York Giants, a team you would give your right arm to beat and vice versa, for sending a gift. "When you have a wonderful mother-in-law who takes sides with you and squabbles against her own daughter, that's something," Gehrig said. "When you have a father and mother who work all their lives so that you can have an education and build your body, that's something. When you have a wife who's been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, that's the finest I know." Again, he took in the crowd's love, and one last time he braced himself. "So I close in saying, I might have had a bad break, but I have an awful lot to live for. Thank you." Gehrig broke down after that, but so did everyone. As the papers wrote, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Ruth cried too. So many things happened in a flurry after that. By the end of the year, the Baseball Writers Association of America voted unanimously to simply put Gehrig into the Hall of Fame immediately, without a standard election or waiting period. That's good to remember when people say Mariano Rivera was the only player elected unanimously to the Hall of Fame. Roberto Clemente received similar treatment after his untimely death, in that the Baseball Writers of America Association waived his 5-year waiting period, but his vote was not unanimous. Soon after, Gehrig became the first player in American sports to have his number retired. And most people think the story ends there. But in fact, Gehrig lived for almost 2 years after his luckiest man speech. They were a difficult and painful 2 years as his body rebelled against him, and he teetered between hope and despair while doctors tried to figure out what his disease was. There were times he felt sure he would recover, and there were more times when he knew he would not. And then there was the story in the New York Daily News that crushed his spirit just months before he died. Jimmy Powers was the acerbic, passionate, staunch, principled, and fiery sports editor of the New York Daily News, America's foremost sports editor, as it said on the side of Daily News trucks. He grew up in Cleveland and worked at papers in the Midwest before coming to New York, 3 years after Gehrig became a regular in 1928, with the intention of changing the sports world. Powers fought for things. He fought for little things. He was one of the first to insist that stadium scoreboards alert the fans as to whether a ball was a hit or an error. He also fought for big things. It's fair to say that no white sports writer in America fought harder in the early days to integrate the major leagues. In the 1930s and into the 1940s, he wrote column after column railing against baseball's secret agreement to keep African Americans out of the game. He wrote about how great the players were. He said he personally had seen at least 10 who were good enough to play in the majors, and he encouraged white baseball fans to go to Negro Leagues games so they could see the great players they were missing. "How would you like your sister being married to one reader wrote in. Powers responded that indeed he wouldn't want his sister marrying a ball player if that's what he meant by one. "They're too grouchy," Powers said. When integration came to baseball, however, it was through one of Powers' least favorite people in the world, Brooklyn's Branch Rickey. Powers loathed Rickey, and so after Jackie Robinson was signed, Powers' integration columns shamefully went silent. According to Jimmy Breslin's book about Rickey, in a 3-month span in 1946, Powers wrote 80 anti-Branch Rickey columns, but not one about Robinson or the cause that he had fought so hard for a few years earlier. To be fair, Breslin hated Powers and was overstating things to settle some old scores with his longtime newspaper rival. But it's true that Powers' aim wasn't always true. Powers loved to fight, he loved to inflame, he loved to stir things up. When he wrote his book, Baseball Personalities, he purposely chose to avoid writing about those great players who were not quite colorful enough for his taste. He chose instead to write about the egotists, the cheaters, the liars, the showmen, the big mouths. And as for the more genial and upstanding Gehrigs and Joe DiMaggios and Jimmy Foxes, those players were worth more to their teams than a dozen show-offs and blowhards, he conceded. Yet something was missing, something indefinable. As for Gehrig explicitly, Powers explained his absence from the book like so. Gehrig was nice to kids, a swell person. For him, those were disqualifying qualities. His book, he explained, was about the rogues, not the sweethearts. But there was actually another reason Powers did not include Gehrig in his book. In 1940, the Yankees were unexpectedly mediocre for most of the season. They'd won 4 straight World Series titles, including 1939 after Gehrig retired, and everybody thought 1940 would be the same. But the Yankees got off to an atrocious start, losing 8 in a row in early May, and on August 9th, they still had a losing record and were stuck in 5th place, 10.5 games back. As it turns out, the Yankees were almost unbeatable for the rest of the season. They went 37-15 and nearly caught the Tigers for the American League pennant. But in mid-August, nobody knew that was going to happen. All was disgust and panic around the Yankees. Nobody could figure out what had gone wrong. And Powers decided he had the winning theory. He suggested in great detail that Lou Gehrig had infected the rest of the team with polio. This really happened. The date was August 18th, 1940, and it came at a specific moment when Gehrig was beginning to understand in a deeper way that the end was near for him. "Please don't judge me a crybaby or believe me to be losing my guts," he wrote to his doctor. And he went on, "There is definitely something going on within my body which I do not understand. Our boy," his wife Eleanor wrote to a friend, "is pretty discouraged." And as he tried to come to grips with the terror that he undoubtedly felt in having the disease that would eventually bear his name, Gehrig woke up that day to a headline, "Has polio hit the Yankees?" Powers went all in on this theory. He drew a dystopian illustration of an aging, dying Yankees, or possibly dying Yankees player surrounded by clouds of doom. He included a sidebar box with the headline, "Slumping Yanks," that went through the Yankees player by player along with the odd troubles they were having. Some lowlights. Red Ruffing. He has unexpectedly lost his overpowering fastball. Lefty Gomez has been able to throw with hardly any power at all. Bill Dickey has little of his once great hitting power. Joe Gordon, inexplicably off form. Steve Sundra, strangely ineffective after the best season of his career. Red Rolfe, in and out of the lineup with a recurring eye ailment. And then at the bottom of the box was this statement. Can coincidence explain these simultaneous ailments? Couldn't the polio germ be the common cause? It was a staggering display of irresponsible journalism. Powers wrote a long story that covered 2 pages. According to overwhelming opinion of the medical profession, he wrote, "Poliomyelitis, similar to infantile paralysis, is communicable. The Yankees were exposed to it at its most acute stage. They played ball with the affected Gehrig, dressed and undressed in the locker room with him, traveled, played cards, and ate with him. Isn't it possible some of them also became infected?" It should be said, no doctor had ever said that Gehrig had polio. His disease was relatively new and rare, but not unknown. Doctors had already named it amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. Powers had built his entire premise on the poorly chosen words of one doctor who was asked by Gehrig to put what this is in layman's terms so that people can understand it. The doctor then said it was similar to chronic poliomyelitis, which it is not. Powers continued on his rampage, quoting liberally from Robert Bing's textbook of nervous disorders and continually referring to unnamed players and Yankees who were worried. He did quote one doctor who made the obvious point. There is no similarity between the symptoms of those individual Yankees cases and Gehrig's. Lou suffered from deterioration of the nervous system. The trouble with these other boys is something entirely different. But instead of using that quote to scrap the story, Powers doubled down. Something has happened to the Yanks, he concluded. If Gehrig passed through a stage in which the cause of his ineffectiveness was undetermined, isn't it possible such is also the case with many of the Yanks today? It was one of the most reckless and damaging stories ever printed in the sports section of a newspaper. When Gehrig read it, he was overcome with fury and a deep depression. In a letter to his doctor, according to Jonathan Eig's superb book, The Luckiest Man, he called Powers a yellow so-and-so who hasn't got a gut in his body. Gehrig promptly sued the Daily News for $1 million, stating he was greatly injured in his credit and reputation in the social intercourse with his friends and suffered great pain and mental anguish. Okay, I'll leave it off there, Dad. Sorry. And we will resume next time. Love you. Bye.